Okay, hello everyone. My name is Dayne Feehan. I just graduated from Binghamton University. I'm here today to talk about the first part of my sociology thesis, which was a world-ecological perspective on famine, North Korea's history of industrial agriculture, and Juche ideology. Before we get started, has anyone ever heard of Juche ideology in any sort? Okay, cool. That's more than
There used to
I've
be
ever heard.
full-page ads in the New York Times.
What's that?
It used to be featured in full-page ads in the New York Times.
I'm going to look at that. I didn't know that. Interesting. So an overview of, so I'm doing part one today. It's feminist product. There's a second feminist produced. We don't have time for that today. My research takes a world-ecological interpretation of Juche agriculture in its role in the famine as a converging crisis of environmental and political disruptions, with the goal of identifying how human and extra-human natures in North Korea co-produced an environment that resulted in a famine. And before we jump in, a quick introduction to what the North Korean famine is and was. So it ran from 1994 to 1998. However, on both sides of this period, there was food insecurity. Even now we have food security. You may have heard a thing or two about that. And during this period, you had anywhere from 5 to 10% of the population die. It's difficult to collect data, as you can expect. These ranges from 500,000 to 2.1 million, although the most acceptable estimates is around 800,000. And the traditional literature on why the famine occurred has three predominant perspectives that they take. The first is overall economic decline, which largely says the USSR collapsed. They lost their oil, the North Korea's economy collapsed. I don't find that to be an incredibly convincing argument. We can see economic decline, but why was there a famine, right? And then, so that takes a social phenomenon approach to explaining why the famine occurred. And the second is socialist organizational failure. From the 1960s onward, North Korea had a public distribution system that was closely aligned with its collective farming system, so essentially everything was state-owned and distributed. This argument, again, is taking the social phenomenon approach of why the famine occurred, but this doesn't really go into the explanation of how it worked from the 60s to the 80s, where people were being fed. So how can we look at that in a different light? And then the last, afterthought that people tack on to why the famine occurred was these natural disasters. Hereafter we'll refer to them as extreme weather events. It's kind of like, well, there was this, and also there was some concerns with the weather. North Korea had experienced a plethora of extreme weather events throughout the 90s and right before, anywhere from floods, droughts, hailstorms, tidal waves, typhoons. In a 70-year period, they had 6 of the 8 strongest ENSO oscillation cycles occurred during or before the famine, which we can tie into a larger capitalist climate crisis and being inflicted on North Korea, but that's another discussion, although interesting. And so the argument we're going to look at today is that those traditionally recognized causes of the famine are contextualized by understanding the historical role of Juche agriculture and an industrial agriculture system, and that it wasn't a social phenomenon produced from an economic collapse or socialist organizational failure plus these natural disasters, but rather these things came together in a cohesive way to produce an environment that pushed and pulled each other that resulted in this famine. Largely through these 3 things that occurred. So the pursuit of Juche further encouraged the adoption of industrial agriculture system to increase their domestic food production, and the aggressive policies related to Juche agriculture developed an unstable economic, ecological environment, and then, for lack of a better word, we'll hyphenate those 2 environments, right? They're interlinked in every way, but don't have a word for it. And then the last is their failed attempts to enter capitalist markets. North Korea was not isolationist. They had endeavors to break out of their communist bloc trade partners, but they failed to do so. So Juche ideology is an ideology of self-reliance or self-determination, and it emphasizes this importance for North Korea to have an economic and political independence so as to protect their sovereignty, right? To defend themselves from foreign aggressors in any sense. But that is, again, to stress, not an isolationist policy. They weren't necessarily against trading outside of the communist bloc. In fact, they tried desperately to succeed in that. So North Korea's landscape, North Korea's I'm not in New York anymore, but North Korea is just a bit bigger than New York. It's like maybe 1/5 the size of California. Very mountainous, especially in the northeast. Its landscape is not very suitable for agriculture. Only about 16% of the land is. And to add to that, they have a concentrated rainfall period, the Changma season, wherein half of all rainfall falls July to August. And they've got no oil reserves, which we'll see to complicate things with their industrial agriculture system. So the story of Juche agriculture begins really in the Japanese colonial period. So Korea, the entire peninsula was colonized by Japan from 1910 to 1945, during which Japan intensely reorganized labor on the Korean peninsula such that the northern Korean area would be an industrial hub and the south would be a rice bowl. And in doing so, they invested heavily in medical and chemical industries, hydroelectric power, and mining all throughout the north. And in doing so, resulted in a tremendous rise in the industrial labor power in northern Korea. It went from about, at the end, it was about 1.2 million in numbers for their industrial working population, whereas even 10 years prior to that, it was only about 300,000. So it was an incredible shift into what the labor force of northern Korea looked like, and then also this an industrial reflexiveness in the post-colonial period. And so that shift, this demographic spatial shift, allowed the DPRK to industrially orient its agriculture production. And then just a few years after, we have the establishment of the state in 48. We go to, not we, but they, go to war, 1950 to 1953, and the North Korean landscape is decimated. 18 to 22 cities are destroyed. And so these two relations, this colonial memory and the war making that occurred, contributes to this spirit of Juche, of political and economic independence. So that's where we're leading this discussion. And so the Cheongsangri policy is a land reform policy that what initially was a transition of land power from the Korean and Japanese landlords to the peasants now has gone to the state. This is the first real important transformation between human and extra-human nature's relationships on the peninsula as the power dynamics had changed. And so this increased farm size that came as a result allowed for mechanized production and monocropping, and that happened almost instantaneously. So that's this first part, right? And so right before, on the eve of Juche's emergence, in 1964, Kim Il-sung calls for the abandonment of traditional agriculture, right? They pursued this capital-intensive, mechanized production in order to produce more food. And they moved towards a hybrid seed fertilizer water complex. Interestingly, they had to create all their own hybrid seeds since the United States wouldn't trade with them. So they did that all on their own. And so, as we talked about, North Korea was not very well suited for this type of agriculture, so they took on very aggressive farming techniques to deal with these geographic spatial constraints and other climatic factors. And so now we have Juche ideology in 1965, although North Korea will tell you it's been there since the dawn of time. Emphasizing political and economic independence, and at the same time, and not unrelated to this, Kim Il-sung stresses they need to upright this trade imbalance. During that period, North Korea imported an abundance of its food, which was obviously stood as a threat to these pillars of Juche of economic and political independence. How can we be independent if we rely on other countries to feed our nation? And so they sought to expand beyond the communist bloc in order to raise, be able to engage in more monetary trade, which they largely failed to do so due to Western countries were not interested in their low-quality goods. And in the years following, North Korea adopts an independent policy. This is directly, this is a Juche-style approach to not being a compliant client to nor the USSR or China. And so we see in the Juche era, a series of violent and environmental reconstructions in North Korea, both in a mechanized sense and an adoption of agrochemicals. So tractor usage increases sixfold in 20 years. The amount of irrigated land increases fourfold, and these are all powered on electricity and diesel fuel, right? So we can see, although North Korea is like, okay, we're going to be a self-reliant country, we want to expand our force. They were still, this crux of oil was going to come back and bite them in the butt as their industrial agriculture was growing ever oil thirsty. And they also conducted land reclamation projects for terrace fields and reclaiming tidal lands, right? So there's an ecological degradation that was taking place at every turn for the sake of short-term productivity. They also adopted monocropping techniques incredibly early on, and by the mid-1980s they were one of the highest chemical fertilizer application rates in the world. And so we get to the end of Juche agriculture in '84, right? They've showed peak production levels. They're not getting the returns that they used to. And at the same time, these conditional political relationships that they were so dependent on came to an end. The USSR collapses, China withdraws from kind of their undesired relationship with North Korea, and so there's a drastic fall in oil imports. And at the same time, kind of the externalities of these fast and loose agricultural strategies were coming into fruition, right? The soil nutrient depletion from fertilizer application, the erosion from these land reclamation projects was taking stock, exacerbating the effects of these floods, droughts and whatnot, right? These things were natural, these disasters were natural in the sense that the system was created holistically between the humans and extra-human natures, right? These were a co-produced event. The land had become dependent on fertilizer, and we didn't touch upon this much, but deforestation ran rampant in and throughout the famine, further decreasing biomass stock. And so North Korea's, for lack of maybe there's a world ecological environment, or the state ecological environment that North Korea had developed for the last 30 years was in a state of volatility and very vulnerable in the 90s. It wasn't able to withstand the shocks that it experienced, ranging from their prolonged dependence on the communist bloc, their oil-thirsty land, and their unstable, just ecological environment at all. And not to mention the fact that the infrastructure that was implemented in the 1970s was largely in need of replacement, right? And the collapse of their relations with the USSR prevented them from having access to the materials that they needed to repair them. And so the success of Juche, if it were to have succeeded, right, these pursuits, they didn't do it for naught. They didn't account for they accounted as if nature would be non-reactive, right? They didn't account for the responses that the rest of nature would have on these on their activities. In addition to that, they failed to expand their relations outward. And so Juche agriculture's effects were beyond the political and economic relations, and had tangible effects on how they organized their environment. And in doing so, it became vulnerable. And so, to conclude, these Juche-inspired policies led to the development of an agriculture system self-sufficient only outside the rest of nature. That their failed efforts to break out of their communist foreign trade market made certain that the DPRK wouldn't be able to have, a fix to these problems that they were facing in the 90s. And going through quickly, these several observations of where moments of human and extra-human nature's relationships were fundamentally altered. These were the things that led to the famine, right? Firstly, with the demographic spatial shift of labor that pushed them to an industrially oriented agriculture system, the abolishment of the private land ownership, the consolidation of land ownership to the state, which then could impose these practices widespread, and then the pursuit of these industrial agriculture techniques that emphasized short-term production over the longevity of the ecosystem. That's it. Thank you.